So I think we almost finished up Sartre. Again, he understands that Sartre doesn't like, doesn't like determinism, says we're in bad faith if we pretend that our actions are not free. But he knows we're tempted to do that, and that's kind of the origin of the claim that we're condemned to be free. In other words, for Sartre, we are free and responsible for our choices, whether we like it or not. Frankly, I think when we read this, I took a course on free will. And one of the things my graduate school professor pointed out is, well, where's the body come in all this in Sartre's discussions? And it comes in part in his discussion of facticity. But frankly, if you look at what I say in the PowerPoints there, I think that's where Sartre gives the game away. Because when he starts talking about the fact that there are some things that we cannot choose to do, right? We can't choose to drink cyanide and live, or walk across the street and get run over by a bus, or walk out a third floor window or a second floor window, flap our arms and fly, right? Well, you say, well, Sartre, just why is it that we can't do some of these things? Isn't it in part because exactly the thing that you deny exists really does exist, that there is an essential human nature to us, and what we are as physical beings is part of that human nature, That's why I say I think he kind of gives the game away in talking about. So he talks about our facticity as having these things that we can't control. But so I'm going to move on here. Again, we did not talk about ethical egoism, although a number of you chose to write on question 9, a perennial favorite. I always separate them out. And I have people at Essex doing the same way, and usually count on at least half the class doing question 9. On psychological egoism, which is a psychological theory about motives, but then there's an attached ethical theory called ethical egoism, which is a consequentialist ethical theory along with utilitarianism. In other words, but a lot of people find egoism very controversial because it says that my only moral responsibility is to maximize the results of what I do for myself. To bring about the best consequences on balance for me. The consequences for you, whether they are good or bad, for egoism are irrelevant. Now, that's not the case for utilitarianism, because utilitarianism says the consequences that matter are the consequences for everyone affected by what I do. Or if it's a public policy decision, like whether or not to build something like the Bakun Dam, the consequences would be those that affect society as a whole. And so Bentham's famous quote about this, and I don't have that in the reading, but it's for utilitarian reasoning, each is to count for one, but none for more than one. That is, the consequences of what I do, insofar as they affect me, count, but for utilitarian reasoning, they should not count as any more than the consequences for anyone else affected by what I do. So that's what he means by each is to count for one. The results for me matter in utilitarian reasoning, but none for more than one. I shouldn't look at the consequences for me as being more important than the consequences for other people. Now, in the real world, that's very hard to do, you know. But this was Bentham and Mill's original thought that we could take what is called the moral point of view. We could take the part, when we're doing utilitarian reasoning, of a disinterested observer. That is, of somebody who, even though you're making a moral decision that actually affects you, is making the decision as if you were just a spectator on the sidelines and it didn't affect you. All you want to do is figure out what's the right thing, but in terms of utilitarian reasoning, you know. So ideally, we should be that objective. That's called taking the moral point of view, a disinterested perspective, which an egoist cannot do by definition, right? An egoist can't say, well, I'm going to pretend that the consequences for me don't matter, when they have a moral theory that says the consequences for them are the only thing that matters. You can't take that kind of objective perspective as an egoist. So for consequentialist moral theories, then the relationship between an action's result and the moral rightness or wrongness are that is the only thing that comes into play in determining whether what we do is morally right or wrong. The results or the consequences. Nothing else matters for consequentialist theories. We didn't get into any non-consequentialist theories, so I'm going to run by this one quickly. But basically, non-consequentialist theories can take consequences into account, but they also say there might be other factors, like whether or not we have an obligation to keep our promises, and we made a promise in the past, or you know, whether or not someone's rights are being violated. So, how do Bentham and Mill differ in their views concerning qualitative differences in pleasures? Well, you know, again, the word to remember for Bentham is quantity of pleasure. That's all that matters. Pleasures are on a par. As long as their quantity is the same, then they have equal value for utilitarian reasoning. And we saw that this left utilitarianism open to the criticism that it's a moral theory that gives us a very low view of human beings and human nature. It sees us only as creatures of pain and pleasure. And if all pleasures are on a par, then there's no difference between, say, reading the pleasure you might get reading the poetry of Maya Angelou, for instance, versus the pleasure the pig out there in the field gets from eating slop. If the amount's the same, then they're on a par, you know. So the criticism was, well, you know, you're reducing us to the level of the beast in the field, of swine. You know, I didn't, if you read that Mill selection, you will see that's exactly what he says was being said about utilitarianism. And that, hence the piggyback. I couldn't find a graphic. This was back before, there were such big databases on the web of graphics. And the graphics you were working with were the ones that came with the program in a file. Anyway, I don't want to get off onto a tangent. So, act utilitarianism can justify breaking a promise if the consequences are better than the opposite. Again, I really should probably have taken this part out because I said don't worry much about, but an example, a trumped up example is if somebody, suppose you're a Benthamite and somebody says, somebody who's dying, right? And nobody else knows about the fact that they have $50,000 in their mattress. And you're basically honest, and you're a Benthamite utilitarian, and you want to do the right thing. So this person says, look, I've got a nephew. I know people say he's a ne'er-do-well, spends too much of his time in gambling, casinos, and womanizing, but still he's the only relative I have left. I'd like you to take this $50,000 and give it to my only nephew. And you say, well, I promise I will. Well, the point is, on Benthamite reasoning, your only obligation is not necessarily to keep a promise if keeping that promise doesn't lead on balance to the best results for all concerned. So think about it. Let's suppose that the nephew's going to kind of squander away the money. Maybe he's going to make a few, dealers in Vegas happy by tipping them more. But, suppose instead you took that money and gave it to, say, a children's hospital where you can relieve a lot of pain and suffering and make people happier. Well, act utilitarianism could basically justify breaking that promise if you had better results by, giving the money, say, to a children's hospital. Now, if you have an intuition that says, well, yeah, but that notwithstanding, it was the man's money and his property rights and his right to decide what he wanted to do with it, his autonomous decisions should be respected even if you don't particularly agree with them. And also, you did make a promise, and you have a moral obligation to keep your promises. So in spite of the fact that society would be better benefited by giving the money to a children's hospital, you ought to keep your promise. If that's the intuition you have, then that's a non-consequentialist approach. That's an approach that says that respecting somebody's rights and autonomy and having obligations to keep promises. Think about it. Utilitarianism cares only about future consequences. It makes the past irrelevant. If the guy made a promise, when did he make a promise? In the past, right? And so utilitarianism doesn't have an adequate way of talking about that. Likewise, when you come to it as a theory of punishment, it can only look to future consequences as the reason why we're morally justified as a society in punishing somebody. If you get more good results than the pain and suffering you're causing the punished person by protecting society, by rehabilitating the person so that they don't do crimes anymore, by deterring future potential offenders, then that's how utilitarianism cares about. But the notion of desert, that is, that somebody deserves something for what they did, is not something utilitarianism can capture. You know, it can't say, well, we ought to punish this person just because they deserve it for what they did, for the horrible crime they committed. You know, so anyway, now some of this there's. I thought I had a bit more of this. I kind of go back to the beginning because these are really from two different review sheets. So what is, again, hedonism is a view that says only one thing is good for its own sake alone. Call it pleasure or happiness. It is the only good that's good in itself. The word we use is intrinsically good, but I didn't throw out that vocabulary. All other goods are called instrumentally good. That is, they are only good insofar as they bring about pleasure or happiness or lessen pain and unhappiness. But all other goods are not good in and of themselves for hedonism. And so, now the reason Mill seems to abandon hedonism and talking about higher pleasures is he claims it's better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool or a pig satisfied. That is, it's better to have a lower quantity of pleasure, but have that pleasure be a higher pleasure, like the pleasure of discussing philosophy with your peers that Socrates might have had than, other than, say, the pleasures of just mere sensation, eating and drinking. But that is to say that there's something intrinsically valuable about higher pleasures that is not just pleasure itself, which is essentially to abandon hedonism, because you're saying what makes these pleasures more valuable is not just that there's more pleasure or less pain, these higher pleasures. And so more contemporary utilitarians are like Jonathan Glover, who you saw in the video, who are pluralists. They self-consciously say, well, no, we're not just strictly hedonists. We think there are other things like knowledge, satisfaction of human preferences, self-realization, other things that are valuable in themselves. And these are some of the things that make Mill's higher pleasures more valuable. That the hedonists are wrong in saying that just pleasure and happiness are the only things intrinsically valuable. So these are called pluralists in that they have a plurality of standards for moral good. They agree with the hedonists in saying happiness is good in and of itself, but they say it's not the only thing that's good in and of itself. That's where the pluralists differ. And so Mill was basically a pluralist, even though he didn't know. In trying to defend hedonism, he actually abandons it. Must one be a hedonist to be a utilitarian? And here, again, if you talk about pluralism, the answer is you don't need to be a hedonist to be a utilitarian. You can have a plurality of standards. So it would be false that all utilitarians are hedonists. Some of them are pluralists when it comes to standards for good. So we saw the principle of utility, if you define it generally, it's that we should do those actions which on balance give you more good than bad results, that give you more good consequences than bad. Now, when both Mill and Bentham define the principle of utility, they defined it hedonistically. In other words, if you look at that long, convoluted definition in that Bentham reading of the principle of utility, he calls it the greatest happiness principle. You know, that he's saying that that the right thing to do is what augments more happiness than unhappiness, and the wrong thing is what gives you less happiness and more pain and unhappiness, both for individual moral decisions and for society. I'm basically paraphrasing what he says, but he defines the principle of utility hedonistically. But you do not have to be a hedonist to be a utilitarian. Now, we saw that Bentham's original naive belief that we could attach exact values to calculations of pains and pleasures was far too optimistic, right? One, you have the problem that I can't see into your skin, right? I don't know how something is going to affect you, and also pains and pleasures, since they are subjective, there's no objective way to specify what's to count as one hedon's worth of pleasure or minus one hedon's worth of pain. And as I said, the problem that raises is, how do you know how many you have of something until you know what is to count as having one of that thing? In standards like what is a metric, you know, meter and stuff like that, they're defined very exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, in essence, are you saying that it's almost impossible to be objective when it comes to emotions and feelings?
Well, that's one point, right? Can we really have the objectivity? But it's also impossible for us to look at other people's inner feelings of happiness and pain and to say, okay, well, I can see objectively what should count as a unit's worth of pleasure. You know, I mean, it's subjective, and there's really no way to specify it. Yeah. Because as I said, if you look at these Bureau of Standards definitions for ordinary things that we, you know, what's to count as an acre or a foot or a, well, I mean, they are really exacting, and you know, but we can, you know, because we're dealing with objective things out here in the world, not with people's inner sensations. So if you don't know what's to count as one hedon's worth of pleasure, it's a non-starter. Exactly. Trying to count them because you don't know what's going to count as one of them, how can you go from there? Yes, hospitals use a scale of 1 to 10, you know, for how somebody's feeling today, but it's understood by the medical people that all they're asking for is a patient's subjective assessment of how they're feeling today, you know. And if somebody says, man, you know, hey, I was doing pretty good. My pain was down to a 4 yesterday, but boy, it's up to an 8 today. Then you know they're feeling worse today, and considerably worse, right? But it isn't like, even though they're subjectively assigning numbers, it isn't like that's an objective standard that counts for all people, you know. And so, as I said, the way if you look, what are the strengths and weaknesses of his hedonistic calculus? Well, we just talked about the weaknesses. But the way you can get around some of these criticisms, at least around what counts as a unit, is to marry the moral theory of utilitarianism with the accounting principle of developing a cost-benefit analysis. And so you're saying the right thing to do for a society is to make those public policy decisions that on balance give us the most benefits for the costs involved, you know. And of course, if you looked at the Bakun Dam, not hedonistically, which you could, right? Hedonistically, you'd be balancing out the happiness of providing a higher standard of living, cheap, more available electricity for maybe hundreds of thousands, millions of people, versus the unhappiness of the 10,000 displaced peoples, and the unhappiness of the animals in the forest. So you can talk about that hedonistically, but you could also talk about it in terms of a cost-benefit analysis. And there it's very hard to come against the dam, right? By the way, there's no N on the end. I always get essays, you know, about building the DAMN. You know, no N. You know, the four-letter word has an N on the end, but dam is a three-letter word. But the point is, if you're saying, well, is building this dam going to give us more economic benefits than the costs? Well, it's kind of hard to say that it isn't, right? I mean, this is something that's going to generate electricity once you get it going from just the ordinary flow of the water for 50 to 100 years, you know. And so I think that's, you know, it's economic decisions that I think have tipped the scales for our wanting to build these things and other people. And as I said, I mean, that one in Malaysia was built in the late 90s. It was completed. And just a few years ago, China put online the largest hydroelectric dam in the world, you know, so it's still being built. Anyway, well, I already answered the last one about quantitative versus qualitative differences. Any observations, questions? You know, so again, I mean, you still want to review some, even though you can use your materials, because, you know, you want to look at a question and say, oh yeah, I remember that was discussed early in the Bentham part of that PowerPoint. Or, yeah, that's a question that was answered in Mill. Or I had this, you know, again, the Mill selection in your readings is highlighted. And that highlighting will show up even in a black and white printing, you know, it'll show up as grayness around it. You know, so, you know, you still want to review. But you do have, if you get here on time, you have almost 2 hours to do it. It's just going to be 30 questions. Was it 20 multiple choice? 20 multiple choice, 10 true false. I already had to make it up to get it to the printer so that you have. Well, yours is on Monday, but the other people will have to have theirs Friday. So, again, remember your Scantron form, again, so obviously no class Friday. This is the last class day, right? The next time we see each other is during the final exam. I'm going to try to get all of your term papers graded by then to give them back to you on exam day. Yeah.
So we don't have class Friday.
That's correct. In other words, classes are done